Celestial War Series, The Silent Draft. Chapter 1. The Gray the Warmth came first. It started at the edges of his awareness, soft and heavy, pressing inward from every direction until it filled the space where his body used to be. There was no pain. He remembered pain, a distant, fading impression of something sharp in his chest, pressure, voices above him speaking in tones that meant urgency. But it was dissolving, the details bleeding out of his memory the way color bleeds out of fabric left in the sun. His name was Elias. He held that for a while. It sat in the center of his consciousness, solid and familiar, an anchor in the warmth. Elias. He had been someone. He had been somewhere. There had been a room, and the room had a window, and outside the window there had been what? Trees. No, a street. The sound of something, children or birds or water running in a gutter. It was getting harder to tell. The details softened. The memory of the window became the memory of light, which became the feeling of warmth, which became the warmth itself. He was drifting. The gray was everywhere, above, below, in every direction that he could discern. It had no surface and no depth. It was not dark. It was not light. It was the precise, neutral color of an overcast sky reflected in still water, and it extended forever. Other presences drifted nearby. He could feel them, faint impressions of weight and warmth, each one pulsing with a dim, irregular rhythm. They were dormant. Most of them had been dormant for a very long time. Their light was almost gone, their shapes barely distinguishable from the gray around them. They drifted like sediment in still water, slow, suspended, at peace. Elias was brighter than them. He could sense that without understanding what it meant. His luminescence was stronger, his pulse more defined. The memories he was losing were still fresh enough to generate warmth as they dissolved. A woman's face. He couldn't hold the details, the color of her eyes, the way her mouth shaped specific words, but the feeling of her was still present, a residual heat in his chest that was fading slowly, reluctantly, as if the memory was clinging to him as hard as he was clinging to it. He let go. He didn't decide to let go. The warmth took it, gently, the way sleep takes a thought you were holding. The woman's face became a feeling. The feeling became warmth. The warmth joined the gray. Time passed. It was not measurable. There were no intervals, no markers, no rhythm to break the continuous, peaceful dimming. Elias was less than he had been. The name was still there, but it felt lighter, less necessary. He was settling into the gray the way a stone settles into sand, slow, heavy, permanent. The dormancy was not unconsciousness. It was closer to the moment just before sleep takes you, when you can still feel the pillow and the weight of the blankets, but you've stopped caring about anything beyond the comfort of being still. He was almost down, almost settled, almost gone. The pulse hit him like a hand, slamming flat against a window. It came from above, or from the direction that felt most like above in a space without orientation. A pressure wave of concentrated energy that tore through the gray and struck his dimming consciousness with a force that had nothing to do with the soft, gentle dissolution he'd been sinking into. Golden light, blinding, hard-edged, cutting through the gray like a blade through smoke. The warmth that had been cradling him recoiled, and in its absence the gray went cold. Elias convulsed. The sensation was not physical. He had no body to convulse, but the closest comparison was being dragged out of a warm bed by the ankles into freezing air. His awareness flared, bright and panicked, the dormancy peeling back in jagged layers. Fragments surfaced that he'd already released. The woman's face, the window, the sound of water. They came back wrong, distorted, overlapping, as if someone had shattered a photograph and was holding up the pieces at random. Something massive passed through his vicinity. He couldn't see it. Sight didn't function the same way here, but he could feel it. Displacement. Weight. A long, heavy presence dragging through the gray, creating a wake of churning energy that tossed the nearby dormant souls like debris in a current. The golden light clung to it, radiating outward in harsh, pulsing waves. Where the light touched a dormant soul, the soul flared, a brief, involuntary spike of brightness, and Elias felt the pull. A directional force, sharp and specific, hauling something upward through the gray toward the source of the golden light. A sound. He didn't hear it. Sound was as irrelevant as sight in this place. but his consciousness received it as a vibration, a shearing, high-frequency pressure that he processed as screaming. Something was being taken, dragged. The golden presence was hauling it upward with a mechanical, rhythmic force, and the thing being taken was not going willingly. Then the golden light withdrew. The massive presence ascended, pulling its wake behind it. The churning energy settled. The gray smoothed. The cold retreated, and the warmth began to return, seeping back into the spaces the pulse had torn open. Elias drifted in the aftermath. His flared awareness was dimming again, the panic subsiding, the fragments of memory sinking back into the gray. The woman's face dissolved for the second time. The window closed. But the dormancy didn't take him fully. The pulse had left something behind, a residual charge lodged in his consciousness, a splinter of alertness that wouldn't dissolve. He settled toward sleep, reached the edge of it, and hovered. The gray pressed against him. The warmth returned. The other dormants around him had already resettled, their brief flares extinguished, their slow dissolution resumed. Elias hung in the liminal space between dormancy and awareness, neither sinking nor surfacing, carrying the fading impression of the prior events. He didn't know what had happened. He didn't have the context, the language, or the awareness to understand what he'd just felt. He had a fragment, golden. He had a sensation, pulling. He had an absence, something that had been nearby was gone. The gray settled around him, the warmth pressed in. He drifted. But he didn't sleep. Welcome to the Portal Library. Step through and let the magic begin. Make sure to like, subscribe, and comment if you'd love more stories or have a request. We have a Patreon where you can support the story production directly or to follow for free and stay up to date with new story drafts notifications. The link will be included in the description below. New videos are uploaded on YouTube every Monday. Celestial War Series, The Silent Draft, an epic fantasy story. Chapter 2, The Stirring. The woman's name had been something that started with a vowel. Elias drifted with that fragment for a long time. He couldn't recover the full name, it sat just beneath the surface of his awareness, a shape he could feel but not grasp. He knew it the way you know a word that's on the tip of your tongue, present, maddeningly close, refusing to arrive. The rest of her was already gone. The face had dissolved twice. The feeling of warmth in his chest was fainter now, dimmer, as if the memory was a coal that had been burning since he arrived and was finally running out of heat. He had lost other things too. The room with the window was gone entirely. The street outside it, if it had been a street, was gone. The sound of water, children, birds, whatever it had been, was a faint hum without source or shape. His name was still there. Elias. It felt thinner, though, less like a fact and more like a habit. The liminal space was not comfortable. Dormancy had been warm and yielding, a gradual surrender that asked nothing of him. This was different. He hovered at the boundary, aware enough to notice the gray, aware enough to sense the dim presences of the dormant souls drifting nearby, but unable to either settle into their peace or rise into something more coherent. He was stuck in the shallow water between sleep and waking, and the longer he stayed there, the more the warmth cost him. The second pulse arrived without warning. The golden light tore through the gray in the same violent eruption, but this time Elias was already partially alert. The jolt didn't have to drag him out of deep dormancy. It caught him at the surface, and the difference was enormous. Where the first pulse had been a fevered dream of fragments and confusion, the second was sharper, more detailed, more terrible. He felt the hook. Not as a concept or an abstraction. He felt its physical presence as it descended through the gray, a massive, curved object radiating concentrated golden energy, inscribed with patterns that pulsed in a rhythmic sequence. The patterns were not random. They followed a structure, a logic, repeating at intervals that suggested calibration. Something had designed this. Something had built it with intention. The chain followed. Heavy, segmented, each link ringing against the next with a resonance that traveled through the gray and vibrated in the core of his awareness. The chain extended upward through a breach in the formless ceiling of the realm, a ragged, bright wound in the gray through which something immense and luminous was visible. Not anything he had a name for. Just light, concentrated and absolute, pressing down through the opening with the weight of an ocean held behind a cracking dam. The hook reached the depth where the densest dormant souls had settled and began its sweep. The golden energy expanded outward in a targeting pulse, the same pulse that had jolted Elias the first time, but from this closer vantage, he could feel its function. It was searching. The pulse washed over the dormant souls and measured them, reading their brightness, their density, their emotional charge. The souls that registered above a threshold flared involuntarily, their dormancy stripped away in a single, violent instant of forced awareness. 3 souls near Elias flared simultaneously. He felt each one, a sharp, bright spike of consciousness where a moment ago there had been peaceful dimness. They were confused, terrified, suddenly aware for the first time in centuries, and they had no chance to understand what was happening before the hook found them. The chain went taut. The mechanical rhythm of the retrieval engaged, the same grinding, rhythmic force Elias had felt during the first pulse, but now he understood what it was doing. It was pulling. The 3 flared souls were being drawn upward, their luminescence stretching and distorting as the hook's energy locked onto their signatures and hauled them toward the breach. One of them resisted. Elias didn't know how. The soul had no limbs, no muscles, no physical mechanism for resistance. But something in its newly awakened consciousness fought the pull, contracting inward, dimming itself in a desperate, instinctive attempt to slip free. The hook held. The resistance lasted but a fleeting moment. Then the soul's contraction failed, its brightness flared back to full, and the chain dragged it upward through the gray with the same indifferent mechanical force. They started to scream, all 3 of them, transmitting the same shearing vibration of absolute terror as they were pulled toward the breach. The sound traveled through the gray and struck Elias' consciousness with a clarity he hadn't experienced during the first jolt. These were people. They had been resting. They were being taken. The breach sealed. The golden light withdrew. The chains ascended and disappeared. The gray settled. Where the 3 souls had been, there was nothing. Not even a depression in the gray. They were gone, and the space they had occupied closed over them as if they had never existed. Elias drifted in the aftermath, more aware than before, less settled. The second jolt had pushed the residual charge deeper, embedding it in whatever passed for the foundation of his consciousness. He was losing the ability to reach dormancy at all. The boundary that he'd been hovering above was receding, dropping away from him, leaving him stranded in the shallow water of the liminal space with nothing to hold onto. He became aware of the other presence gradually. Not a jolt, not a sudden arrival, a slow, incremental recognition that something nearby was pulsing at a rhythm different from the dormant souls. It was faint, uneven, carrying the same residual charge that Elias carried, the same quality of forced wakefulness. Another near miss. The presence drifted closer, or Elias drifted toward it. The distinction was meaningless in the gray. What mattered was the proximity, the gradual narrowing of the distance between 2 dim, flickering points of awareness in an ocean of sleeping dead. Contact was not language. It was not thought. It was the closest thing Elias could compare to standing next to a stranger in the dark and realizing, without words, that they were afraid of the same thing. The other soul was older than Elias. Not in human years, in time spent in the gray. Its luminescence was dimmer, its edges more diffuse. Whatever memories it had carried when it arrived had mostly dissolved. But the residual charge was stronger, layered, carrying the accumulated impression of multiple jolts. This soul had been near-missed more than once. It had been hovering in the liminal space for a long time. It carried fragments. Elias received them not as words or images, but as impressions, sensory residue transferred through proximity. From the other soul he received regularity. The golden intrusions followed a pattern. They were not random events. They came at intervals, and the intervals had a rhythm that could be anticipated. The other soul had been tracking the pulses through its own repeated near misses, counting the spaces between them, building a crude internal map of when the golden light would return. From Elias, the other soul received structure. The hook was not a natural phenomenon. It was built. The patterns inscribed on its surface followed a designed logic. Something with intelligence and purpose had constructed the mechanism that was taking the dead. The exchange took no time and all the time in the world. They drifted together in the gray, two fragments of awareness pressing against each other, sharing impressions through a process that was closer to osmosis than communication. The other soul pulsed faintly with what Elias processed as recognition, not of him, not of his identity, but of his experience. They had felt the same thing. They carried compatible fragments. Together, the fragments formed a slightly larger picture. The golden light came at intervals. The golden light was built. The dead were being taken by something that followed a schedule and used a tool. It was not much. Two partial truths held by two dissolving consciousnesses in an infinite gray silence. But it was more than either of them had alone. The other soul drifted. Elias drifted. They didn't separate. They remained in loose proximity, two dim points of awareness orbiting each other in the space between sleep and dissolution, carrying their shared fragments and waiting for the next pulse to bring more. Somewhere above them, the gray was quiet. The breach was sealed. The hooks were retracted. For now. Chapter 3, The Whispered Chain. They were 7 when Elias stopped counting. The near-miss souls accumulated the way sediment gathers at a bend in a river, slowly, pulled by a current none of them fully understood. Each new arrival carried their own residual charge, their own fragments, their own confused impressions of the golden intrusions. Some had been jolted once. Others, like the soul Elias had first encountered, carried the layered residue of multiple pulses. They drifted toward each other. They were not a group. They were a cluster, a loose, shifting collection of dim consciousnesses orbiting each other in the gray, close enough to exchange impressions, but too fragmented to sustain anything resembling organization. They had no leader, no structure, no common language. What they had was proximity and a shared experience. The golden light had touched each of them, and none of them could sleep anymore. The fragments multiplied. Each new near-miss brought a different piece, a different angle, a different moment from a different pulse. One soul had been close enough to the breach to feel the temperature of the light pouring through it, a searing, sterile heat that carried no warmth. Another had been near a soul that was taken, and had received, in the moment of separation, a burst of raw emotional transmission, not words, but the distilled terror of something being ripped from rest against its will. A third had been jolted awake near the edge of the hook's sweep, and had felt the targeting pulse pass over them, reading their signature, finding them too dim to take, and moving on. The argument began with the soul who had been a priest. Elias couldn't know this with certainty. Identity had dissolved too far for titles or professions to survive intact. But this soul carried a residual structure that felt different from the others. Its fragments were organized around a central axis of conviction, a deep, persistent pattern of belief that had survived dormancy, and the jolts with more coherence than anything Elias had encountered. The priest soul's interpretation of the golden intrusions was absolute. The hooks were a calling. The light was divine. The souls being taken were being elevated, chosen for their brightness, selected by a higher power, drawn upward into something greater than the gray. The pain, the screaming, the violence of the extraction, those were the birth pangs of transcendence. The dead were not supposed to stay here forever. They were supposed to ascend. The hooks were the mechanism of ascension. The conviction radiated from the priest soul with a density that influenced the cluster. 2 of the newer arrivals, souls with weaker charges and fewer fragments, absorbed the interpretation and settled into it. It made sense. It was comforting. If the golden light was divine, then being taken was not a horror but a reward. The dead who screamed were simply afraid of glory. The resistance of the soul Elias had watched during the second pulse was not survival instinct, it was faithlessness. Elias pushed back. Elias' fragments pressing against the priest soul's conviction, the 2 interpretations grinding against each other in the space between them. Elias transmitted the impression of structure. The hook was built. The patterns on its surface were designed, calibrated, mechanical. This was not a divine hand reaching down to collect the worthy. This was a tool, constructed by something that wanted what the dead contained. The priest soul received the impression and rejected it. The rejection was not violent, it was a quiet, absolute closing, a wall of certainty that Elia's fragments could not penetrate. To the priest's soul, the fact that the hook was built was not evidence of exploitation. It was evidence of engineering. Of course the divine would use precision. Of course ascension would have a mechanism. The beauty was in the design. The cluster fractured along the line of the disagreement. The priest's soul and its two adherents drifted to one side, their combined luminescence pulsing in a slow, synchronized rhythm of shared conviction. Elia's, the older near-miss soul, and two others drifted to the other, carrying the weight of their mechanical interpretation. Neither side could prove their case. Nobody knew what happened to the souls after they were taken. Whatever waited on the other side of the golden light was invisible from here. A new soul arrived. Fresh, bright, carrying the dense luminescence of recent death and a residual charge from being jolted almost immediately upon entering the gray. The pulse had caught this soul within what might have been hours of their death, before dormancy had taken hold, before the memories had begun to dissolve. The new soul was different because the new soul remembered. Not fragments, not impressions. Actual memories, vivid and warm, still carrying the heat of a life recently lived. The cluster drifted toward the brightness instinctively, drawn by the warmth. The new soul's memories spilled outward through proximity, uncontrolled, disorganized, flooding the surrounding gray with impressions of a life that had ended. A kitchen with blue tiles, rain on a tin roof, the smell of bread rising, a daughter's voice calling from another room, the weight of a sleeping child in the crook of an arm. Elias received the impressions and felt something shift inside him. Not the specific memories, those belonged to someone else, but the quality of them, the texture of lived experience, triggered echoes of his own dissolved past. The sound of someone laughing beside him in a space that had been safe. The impression was brief, formless, and it dissolved almost immediately. But for a fraction of a moment, he remembered what it felt like to be a person instead of a collection of fragments. The new soul's brightness was a problem. The cluster could feel it, a beacon in the gray, drawing the targeting algorithm's attention. When the next pulse came, this soul would be the first thing the hook found. The priest's soul reached toward the new arrival with an impression of comfort. You are bright because you are worthy. When the golden light comes, do not be afraid. You are being called. Elias reached with a different impression. You are bright because you are fresh. Brightness draws the mechanism. Dim yourself. Contract inward. Reduce your signature before the next pulse. The new soul hung between the two competing impressions. Confused, terrified, carrying the weight of a life that was still warm enough to feel like something worth protecting. The pulse came. The golden light tore through the gray, and the hook descended with its terrible, calibrated precision. The targeting sweep expanded outward, reading the field, measuring signatures. The new soul flared, bright, vivid, unmissable. The priest's soul transmitted a surge of reassurance. Peace, acceptance, surrender to glory. Elias transmitted a surge of urgency. Contract, dim, compress, hide. The new soul did neither. It hung in the gray, paralyzed between the two competing pressures, its brightness pulsing wildly. The hook found it. The chain went taut, the pull engaged. The new soul screamed, the same shearing vibration that Elias had felt from the three taken during the second pulse, but closer, stronger. The golden light dragged it upward through the gray, and the memories spilled out of it as it went scattering into the gray and dissolving. The breach was sealed, the gray settled. The priest's soul pulsed with a calm, steady light. Ascension, the bright are chosen. The system works as intended. Elias drifted in the silence where the new soul had been, carrying the fading impression of their memory, and he knew with a certainty that went deeper than any fragment he'd collected that the priest's soul was wrong. He couldn't prove it, he couldn't articulate it, he had no evidence. But he knew. Chapter 4, The Old One. The cluster had grown to 11 when the ancient stirred. It happened during the interval between pulses. Elias and the older near-miss soul were drifting at the edge of the cluster, exchanging fragments from the last extraction. The priest soul and its adherents occupied the opposite side, pulsing with their steady rhythm of conviction. Between them, deeper in the gray than any of the near-miss souls had ventured. Something moved. The ancient was barely there. Its luminescence was so faint it was almost indistinguishable from the gray itself, a thin, wavering thread of awareness that had been dissolving for so long it had forgotten it was a person. Its edges were gone. Its memories were gone. What remained was a compressed residue of consciousness so old and so degraded that it had settled to a depth where the hook pulses barely reached. The cluster's combined brightness had stirred it. 11 partially aware souls orbiting each other generated enough ambient energy to reach into the deep gray and nudge something that hadn't been nudged in centuries. The ancient rose slowly toward the cluster, drawn by the warmth the same way all of them had been drawn to each other. When it reached the periphery, Elias felt its presence as a whisper against the edge of his awareness, thin, ancient, carrying the residue of a time so distant that the impressions felt alien. The ancient transmitted one fragment. It cost the ancient everything it had left. The fragment was not a memory. It was an absence, a vast, heavy impression of silence, the gray as it had been before the golden light. No pulses, no hooks, no breaches, no chains. The gray had been unbroken. The dead had arrived, settled, dissolved, and the process had been uninterrupted for a span of time so long that the ancient couldn't measure it. Then the sky had torn open for the first time. The ancient had been deep in dormancy when it happened, but the violence of that first breach had jolted every soul in the realm simultaneously. A single, catastrophic rupture that flooded the gray with golden light and dragged the first souls screaming upward through a wound that had never existed before. The fragment ended. The ancient's luminescence guttered, dimmed to nothing, and dissolved into the gray. It was gone, not taken, not hooked. Simply finished. The last trace of a consciousness that had been old when the hooks were new, spending its final flicker to tell 11 strangers that the golden light had a beginning. The cluster absorbed the fragment in silence. The priest's soul's conviction cracked. Not shattered, cracked. The distinction mattered. If the hooks were divine, they should be eternal. If ascension was the natural order, it should have always existed. The ancient's fragment said otherwise. There was a time before when everything was peaceful. Something had started this. The priest's soul withdrew to the edge of the cluster, pulsing erratically. Its 2 adherents drifted with it, their own conviction destabilized by the fracture in their anchor. Elias pressed the advantage, not aggressively but deliberately. He gathered the fragments the cluster had accumulated and arranged them in sequence. The hooks were built. The hooks followed a schedule. The hooks targeted brightness. The hooks had a beginning. Each fact was partial, incomplete, uncertain. Together they pointed in one direction. The dead were being harvested by something. The cluster shifted. The priest's soul and its adherents didn't cross the line. They couldn't abandon their interpretation entirely, not yet, but the wall of absolute certainty had fractured, and through the crack, doubt seeped in. The decay was accelerating. Elias noticed it in himself first. His name still held, but it was lighter, more fragile. The laugh he'd recovered during the new soul's memory spill, the echo of someone beside him in a safe place, was gone. He couldn't remember what it had sounded like. He couldn't remember if it had been a man's laugh or a woman's. The residual heat in his chest was cooling, and the memories it had been generating as they dissolved were running out. He was becoming what the older near-miss soul already was, a carrier of collected intelligence with almost no personal identity left. The fragments about the hooks, the schedule, the structure, those were stable, reinforced by repetition and shared exchange. But the things that made him Elias, the specific, private, irreplaceable details of a life he'd lived, those were dissolving faster as they drifted. The older near-miss soul was worse. Its edges were fraying visibly, the luminescence thinning at the periphery. It had been aware for too long. The gray was pulling it apart, and the fragments it carried, the accumulated intelligence of multiple jolts, were all that held it together. When those fragments were passed to another soul, there would be nothing left. 3 of the cluster's 11 had already faded past the point of useful contribution. They drifted at the outer edge, too dim to exchange, too aware to fully sleep, occupying a dead zone between dissolution and consciousness that consumed them without providing rest. The cluster was a candle burning at both ends. Every moment of awareness cost them. Every fragment they gathered was purchased with a piece of themselves they couldn't get back, and the hooks would keep coming. They needed information they couldn't get from inside the gray. They needed to know what happened after the breach. They needed someone, something that had seen the other side. The cluster drifted in the interval between pulses, carrying its accumulated fragments, losing its edges, waiting for something it didn't know how to name. It came from a direction none of them had felt before. Chapter 5, The Warmth. Something entered the gray that was not golden. The energy signature was darker, warmer, carrying a resonance that vibrated at a frequency entirely different from the hooks. Where the golden pulses were sharp and invasive, this presence radiated a slow, steady heat that spread through the surrounding gray without tearing it. The cluster felt it immediately. 11 partially aware souls, drifting in their loose orbit, turned toward the warmth instinctively. The near-miss souls pressed closer. Even the priest soul and its adherents shifted, drawn by a heat that their fading consciousness craved. Elias moved toward it. The warmth was doing something unexpected as it reached him. The constant, grinding pull of dissolution eased. His edges stopped fraying. The fragments he carried felt more stable, less likely to dissolve into the gray at the next interval. The warmth was sustaining him. 3 figures materialized from deeper in the gray, moving with a purposeful coordination that nothing in the spirit realm possessed. They were not souls. They were solid, dense, radiating the dark warmth from bodies that had physical form and intention. The largest one moved at the front, scanning the gray ahead. The smallest flanked to the side, compact and watchful. The third held the center. The third one stopped when it encountered the cluster. Gadriel had been walking through an ocean of sleeping, dead for 6 days, and none of them could hear him. The spirit realm was exactly as Azazel had described, vast, gray, formless, populated by billions of dormant souls too deeply dissolved to register his presence. He had spoken to them, shouted at them, pushed demonic energy into their vicinity, trying to jolt them into awareness. Nothing. They were too far gone, too settled, too committed to the peaceful dissolution that the realm was designed to provide. 6 days. Tamil was cataloging the dormancy density patterns. Barakiel was grinding his teeth and asking every few hours if they could go back and fight something instead. Gadriel was beginning to accept that Azazel's mission was impossible, that warning the dead required the dead to be at least somewhat aware of their state. Then he walked into a cluster of souls. They were dim, fragile, clearly deteriorating, but they were aware, pulsing with the erratic, uneven rhythm of consciousnesses that were fighting to stay active against the pull of the gray. And they were organized after a fashion. They orbited each other in a loose formation that suggested accumulated proximity, shared experience, something resembling structure. Gadriel stopped. Tamil materialized beside him, their surveillance instincts already cataloging the cluster's configuration. Barakiel moved to Gadriel's flank, his hand reflexively reaching for a weapon he didn't carry in this realm. The souls were pressing toward them, not retreating, pressing closer, drawn by the demonic warmth. "They're awake," Tamil said. "How are they awake?" "I don't know," Gadriel said, "but they can hear us." The contact was chaos. The cluster had never encountered anything with a physical form inside the gray. The souls pressed against Gadriel's presence and received a flood of sensory information that overwhelmed their fragmentary awareness, density, heat, structure, intention. It was too much. Several of the weaker souls contracted inward, their luminescence flickering in distress. The priest soul recoiled entirely, interpreting the dark warmth as contamination. Gadriel tried to communicate. He projected his intent through the same demonic energy that was sustaining their awareness, a deliberate, structured transmission carrying meaning. The souls received it as a wall of noise, too dense, too organized. Their fragmentary consciousness couldn't process information delivered at the bandwidth of a functioning mind. Tamil adjusted. They had centuries of experience calibrating communication for hostile environments. They compressed Gadriel's transmission into a simpler pulse, a single, repeated impression stripped of complexity. The impression was, danger, not from us, from above. Elias received it. The impression landed not as words, but as a directional weight, a pressure pointing upward, toward the breach, carrying the unmistakable emotional signature of warning. Something above them was dangerous, and the beings delivering the warning were not the source of that danger. He transmitted back. The only thing he could transmit at this bandwidth, the fragments, the golden light, the hooks, the schedule, the taking, the ancient's revelation that it had a beginning. Gadriel received the fragments and went still. "They've been studying it," Gadriel said to Tamil. "From the inside. They don't know what happens after the taking, but they know how it works down here." "Can they understand what we're telling them?" Tamil asked. "Not at full bandwidth. We need to slow down, feed it in pieces." Gadriel crouched, a pointless physical gesture in a realm without gravity, but the instinct of a soldier making himself less threatening. He isolated a single piece of information from Azazel's intelligence and compressed it into the simplest possible impression. The forges. He transmitted the impression of fire. Holy fire burning inside a contained structure, souls entering the fire, memories burning away one by one, layer by layer, identity disintegrating. What emerged on the other side? Hollow, empty, sealed in metal. The cluster received it. The reaction was not uniform. The older near-miss soul absorbed the impression with the grim recognition of a suspicion confirmed. Two of the newer souls contracted in shock, their luminescence spiking with raw distress. The priest soul rejected the transmission entirely, pulling away from Gadriel's warmth and dimming itself at the edge of the cluster. Elias held the impression and felt the last piece of the picture lock into place. The hooks descended. The hooks took the bright. The hooks fed them into fire. The fire burned away everything they were. What came out was not ascension. It was erasure. He transmitted a response to Gadriel, not a fragment this time, but a question. The simplest question he could compress into the bandwidth they shared. "Why are you telling us?" Gadriel received it. He transmitted the answer without embellishment, without comfort, without pretense. "Because we are losing a war against the things your erasure builds. Every soul they take becomes a weapon pointed at us. We need you to resist the hooks, not for your benefit, for ours. But right now, those are the same thing." The cluster drifted in the warmth of the demon squad's presence, processing the first external information they had ever received. The ancient's fragment, the forges, the war, the admission that the beings offering help were doing it for themselves. Elias carried it all. His name was barely a whisper now, but the fragments were solid. The picture was almost complete, and the warmth radiating from the three dark figures was keeping him alive long enough to use it. "Will they work with us?" Tamil asked. Gadriel studied the cluster, 11 dim, deteriorating, fiercely aware souls that had been tracking a celestial war machine from inside the belly of its supply chain. "They don't have a choice," Gadriel said. "Neither do we." I hope you are enjoying this story so far. Stay tuned, next week we will begin an Abo series. Don't forget to like and subscribe and to check out our Patreon page. If you are watching on Patreon, I really appreciate your support. Chapter 6, The Split. Gadriel fed them the full picture in pieces over what might have been days. The transmissions came in compressed bursts, each one calibrated to the bandwidth the cluster could process. The forges, their structure, their scale, the assembly lines of empty armor waiting to be filled. The conscripts, what a forged soul became, sealed in golden plate, stripped of everything except compressed rage. The war, angels and demons grinding each other across dimensional battlefields, the conscripts advancing in columns that never stopped, never retreated, never recognized the people they had been. And the hook's purpose, not divine selection, not random harvesting, targeted extraction to feed a production line. The brighter the soul, the higher the energy yield. Fresh arrivals, people who still remembered their lives, who still carried the heat of recent death, were premium material. Elias absorbed each transmission and passed it outward through the cluster. The fragments moved from soul to soul, each one receiving and redistributing, building the shared picture through the same osmotic exchange they'd used since the first near-miss encounters. The process was slow and imperfect. Details degraded in transmission. Context dropped out, but the core held. The hooks were weapons. The forges were factories. The dead were raw material. The priest's soul listened from the edge of the cluster. It hadn't rejoined the center since the ancients' revelation, but it hadn't left either. It drifted in the borderland between the cluster and the open gray, close enough to receive the demon transmissions, far enough to maintain the pretense of separation. The split came on what Elias processed as the third day of Gadriel's presence. One of the adherents, a soul that had followed the priest soul's ascension theology since the early days of the cluster, moved to the center and transmitted a single, compressed impression directed at the entire group. The impression was rejection, not of the information itself. The adherent didn't dispute the forges or the conscripts. The rejection targeted the source. Demons, fallen beings, enemies of the divine by definition. Everything they transmitted was tainted. The forges might exist, but the purpose might be different than what the demons described. The conscripts might serve a function that fallen beings couldn't comprehend. Accepting demon intelligence as truth was accepting the enemy's narrative. 3 souls moved with the adherent. The priest soul followed, its fractured conviction finding enough structure in the rejection to reassemble. 5 souls, nearly half the cluster, pulled away and drifted toward the open gray, dimming as they left the demon warmth behind. Gadriel watched them go. "They'll die out there," he said to Tamil. "Without our warmth sustaining them, their decay rate accelerates. They'll dissolve or get hooked within 2 pulse cycles." "They know that," Tamil said. "And they'd rather dissolve than take information from a demon." "Wouldn't you," Tamil said, "if the situation were reversed?" Gadriel didn't answer. 6 souls remained. Elias, the older near-miss soul, and 4 others who had weighed the competing risks, demon contamination versus willful ignorance, and chosen the option that came with warmth. The dependency settled over them without ceremony. Gadriel positioned his squad as anchors, Barakiel and Tamil taking stations at the cluster's periphery, their demonic energy creating a sustained field that slowed the soul's decay and kept their awareness stable. The effect was immediate and measurable. Elias' fragments felt more solid. The grinding erosion of his edges eased. He could hold information longer, process transmissions more clearly, maintain coherence between the compressed bursts. But the warmth was a leash. If the demons moved, the souls had to follow. If the demons withdrew their energy, the decay resumed at its accelerated rate. The 6 remaining souls were alive because the demons chose to keep them alive, and every moment of sustained consciousness was a debt they could never repay on their own terms. Elias carried the awareness of this dependency without illusion. The demons needed them to resist the hooks. The souls needed the demons to stay conscious. Neither side had chosen the arrangement. Both sides were trapped in it. Gadriel proposed the evasion strategy on what might have been the 5th day. "The hooks target brightness," Gadriel said, compressing the transmission into direct, functional bursts. "You've been tracking the schedule. You know when the pulses come. What you need is a technique for reducing your signature when the sweep hits, compressing your awareness inward so the targeting algorithm reads you as dormant." "We've been doing that instinctively," Elias transmitted. "The near-miss souls survived because they were dim enough to pass under the threshold." "Instinct isn't reliable. I can teach you a controlled compression mechanism, a deliberate contraction that drops your signature to a level the sweep can't distinguish from the background. It costs energy, and it needs to be timed precisely, but it's the difference between luck and strategy." Gadriel demonstrated the technique. He compressed his own energy signature, pulling the demonic warmth inward, tightening it into a dense core that radiated almost nothing. To the cluster, he effectively disappeared. His physical form was still there, but the warmth vanished, and with it, the sustaining field. The decay resumed instantly. 3 seconds later, Gadriel released the compression and the warmth flooded back. 3 seconds, Tamil noted. 3 of them destabilized. Then we train them to hold it without losing cohesion, Gadriel said. The pulse sweeps last approximately 15 seconds. They need to hold compression for 20 to clear the window. The training began. It was crude, difficult, and immediately costly. The souls that attempted full compression found their already fragile coherence threatening to shatter under the pressure. The older near-miss soul managed a 10-second hold before its edges began dissolving at an alarming rate. Two of the newer souls couldn't compress at all. Their awareness was too thin to contract without collapsing. Elias held for 12 seconds on his first attempt. On the second, 14. The compression felt like folding himself into a space too small for what he carried, the fragments pressing against each other, the intelligence grinding into the last remnants of personal identity. When he released the technique, a memory he hadn't known he still had was gone. Every compression cost something. Every practice session spent a piece of identity they couldn't recover. The evasion technique worked, but the price was the same price everything in the spirit realm demanded: your soul. By the time the next pulse came, 4 of the 6 could hold compression for 20 seconds. The golden light swept through their vicinity, the targeting algorithm probed, and passed over them. For the first time, the hooks came and left without taking anyone from the cluster. Gadriel marked the success without celebration. "That buys time," he said. "It doesn't solve anything. The hooks will recalibrate, the sweeps will widen. Evasion is a delay, not a strategy." "Then what's the strategy?" Elias transmitted. Gadriel was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know yet," he said. "The answer is probably somewhere in the fragments you've been collecting." The cluster drifted in the demon warmth, 6 souls carrying an accumulating weight of intelligence, practicing the compression that kept them invisible to the hooks and burning through the last of what they were. Chapter 7. The Seed. The hooks recalibrated on the 4th evasion cycle. The pulse came at the expected interval, and the cluster compressed on schedule, 6 souls contracting inward, signatures dropping below the targeting threshold. The golden light swept through. The algorithm probed. Except this time it didn't pass over. The sweep doubled back. A secondary pulse, tighter and more focused, scanned the area where the cluster had been compressing. The algorithm had adapted. It was reading not just brightness but density, the compressed signatures registering as anomalies in the dormant field, cold spots that were too uniform to be natural. 2 of the 4 trained souls couldn't hold their compression under the secondary sweep. Their signatures cracked, flaring involuntarily. The hook locked onto the nearest one and took it. The chain tightened. The soul was dragged upward, screaming, and the breach sealed behind it. 5 remaining. The second failure came 2 cycles later. The sweeps had widened, covering more of the gray in each pass. The intervals shortened. The safe windows between pulses compressed from hours to what felt like minutes. The evasion technique that had bought them 4 successful cycles was degrading as the algorithm learned. "They're adapting," Gadriel said. "The compression signature is becoming a telltale sign. The more you use it, the more the algorithm maps the pattern." "Then we need something that isn't evasion," Elias transmitted. The first fragment arrived during a near-hook contact. One of the remaining souls, the one who had been closest to the recalibrated sweep, had been partially caught before tearing free. The hook's extraction script had engaged with their outer layers for approximately 2 seconds before the soul contracted hard enough to slip the grip. The experience had cost them most of their remaining coherence, but they carried something back: the script's internal structure. The extraction script was not a blunt instrument. It was layered, a cascading sequence that read the soul in stages, peeling information from the outermost layers inward. The first layer read emotional charge. The second read memory density. The third read identity coherence. Each reading refined the targeting, locking the hook tighter with every layer processed. But the reading moved from the outside in. The outermost layers were processed first. The deepest core, whatever sat at the absolute center of a soul's structure, was the last thing the script reached. The second fragment came from Gadriel. They were discussing the conscripts, the tactical problem they represented, the endless production, when Gadriel mentioned Azazel's encounter with the cracked visor. The soul inside the armor had been purified, stripped, forged into a battery. But when the visor broke, it woke up. For 2 seconds, it was conscious. It grabbed Azazel's arm and transmitted everything it had seen. The purification process wasn't complete. Something at the deepest layer of the soul had survived the forge. Suppressed, buried, but present. If a soul could compress its awareness, not its memories, not its identity, but its accumulated knowledge, into the deepest possible core before the hook took it, the forge would burn through everything on top and leave the compressed seed intact. The soul would arrive inside the armor stripped of everything that made it a person. But the seed would be there, waiting. And if the conscript from Azazel's encounter could wake up from an accidental remnant, a deliberately compressed seed could wake up with purpose. Elias transmitted the idea to the cluster. 5 souls and 3 demons absorbed it in silence. Gadriel was the first to respond. You're proposing that someone volunteer to be taken, deliberately, walk into the hook zone, get forged, and hope the seed survives. Not hope, Elias transmitted. Design. The compression technique you taught us for evasion, we reverse it. Instead of compressing to hide from the hook, we compress to survive the forge. The forge burns at temperatures I can't simulate, Gadriel said. I have no way to test whether a compressed seed would survive the purification. The only test is the real thing. I know, Elias transmitted. The first volunteer dissolved on the attempt. The compression required for a forge-viable seed was orders of magnitude more intense than evasion compression. The soul, one of the newer cluster members, tried to push their awareness into the deepest layer, and the pressure shattered them. Their luminescence fractured outward in a silent burst of dissolving fragments. True eradication, not taken by the hooks, not burned in the forge, simply destroyed by the attempt to survive. The second volunteer held the compression but couldn't sustain it under the hook's extraction script. The outer layers were peeled away, and the seed, insufficiently dense, was pulled apart with them. Another eradication, another permanent loss. The third volunteer succeeded. The older near-miss soul, the one who had been aware longer than anyone, who had been carrying accumulated fragments since before the cluster existed, who had almost nothing left of their original identity, compressed what remained into a seed so dense, it registered as inert matter. They walked into the hook zone at the next pulse. The golden light swept over them, read their brightness, and found enough to target. The hook engaged. The chain tightened. The older near-miss soul was taken. Dragged upward through the breach, carrying a compressed seed of everything the cluster had learned, buried at the deepest layer where the forge fire might pass over it. The cluster didn't know if it worked. There was no way to verify from inside the gray. Gadriel marked the loss on his operational tally. If the seed survives, what does the soul do inside the armor? Elias transmitted the answer. It had been forming in the fragments for longer than he could measure, assembled from the pieces the cluster had gathered across every jolt, every near miss, every dissolving conversation. The conscripts are connected to the celestial infrastructure. The armor interfaces with the angelic systems, the same systems that reach down into the living world to collect faith. If a seed wakes up inside the armor, it has access to that connection. It can reach the living. And do what? Tell them, show them. Everything we know, the hooks, the forges, the machine. If the living see what's being done to their dead, they'd stop believing. If they stop believing, the faith currency stops flowing. Gadriel was quiet. You want to crash a portion of the celestial economy, Gadriel said, using dead people as the delivery mechanism. We're already being used as material, Elias transmitted. At least this way we choose what we're used for. The remaining cluster, 4 souls, each one diminished, each one carrying less of themselves than they had the day before, drifted in the demon warmth and waited for the next pulse. 2 more volunteers compressed their seeds and walked into the light. The gray closed behind them. Chapter 8, The 2 Fronts. The first thing the sleeper felt was the weight. Not gravity, the armor didn't experience gravity the same way a body did. It was the weight of containment. Golden plate pressed against every surface of what had been a soul, sealing it inside a structure that hummed with celestial energy and moved according to instructions that didn't come from within. The sleeper's legs walked. Its arms swung. Its faceplate tracked targets, and its gauntlets struck with mechanical precision. None of it was voluntary. The seed had survived. It sat at the deepest core, compressed and cold, buried beneath the layers of purified rage that the forge had left behind. The sleeper couldn't access its memories. Those were gone, burned clean in the holy fire. It couldn't remember a name, a face, a life. What it carried was the knowing. The hooks, the forges, the machine, the cluster in the gray, the mission. Compressed intelligence without identity. Purpose without self. Awareness returned in fragments. The first fragment was sensation, the hum of the celestial command frequency directing the armor's movements, a constant, low-pitched vibration that the sleeper began to distinguish from the background noise of its own contained energy. The second fragment was observation, the ability to perceive what the armor's sensory array was showing without being consumed by the combat algorithm that processed it. The sleeper could see, it just couldn't act. The third fragment was the hardest, patience. The armor fought. The sleeper watched. It cataloged troop formations, deployment patterns, the rotation cycles between the front lines and the forge maintenance stations. It mapped the relay nodes that coordinated the hook targeting algorithm, 3 stations, each one pulsing at intervals that matched the extraction schedule the cluster had tracked from inside the gray. It stored everything in the compressed seed, building an intelligence profile of the machine from the inside. The breakthrough came on a battlefield. The conscript unit was engaged in close-quarters combat with a demon squad, a standard interdiction, the kind of grinding, mechanical advance that the Golden Infantry executed dozens of times per cycle. The armor drove forward. The gauntlets struck. A demon soldier went down. Another demon, smaller, faster, flanking, closed the distance and drove a blade into the gap between the conscript's breastplate and pauldron. The blade didn't penetrate the celestial steel, but the impact jarred the armor's internal systems. The command frequency stuttered. For approximately 3 seconds, the combat algorithm lost its grip. The sleeper moved. It was a small movement, a fractional rotation of the faceplate, a redirection of the sensory array toward the flanking demon. The demon froze. It was staring at the conscript. The faceplate had turned to look at it. The sleeper transmitted. A compressed burst on a frequency it had isolated from the command grid, too narrow for the celestial monitoring systems to flag, too weak for anything except close-range reception. The burst carried coordinates, formation data, and a signature that identified the transmitter as something other than a standard conscript output. The demon received it. Its expression shifted from shock to calculation. It withdrew without finishing the kill. 3 cycles later, a demon operative made deliberate contact during another engagement. This time the exchange was structured. Compressed bursts traded between blade strikes, intelligence flowing in both directions during the 3-second windows when the combat algorithm stuttered under impact. The demons began training the sleepers. Not in person, through the battlefield exchanges, teaching compression patterns for more reliable transmission, mapping the armor's internal systems, identifying the specific frequencies the celestial monitoring couldn't reach. The sleepers learned to communicate in the gaps between the algorithm's instructions, speaking in the pauses of the machine that controlled them. In the spirit realm, new volunteers continued walking into the hook zones. The success rate held at roughly 1 in 3. Each successful sleeper activated inside the armor and began the slow, invisible work of intelligence gathering. Each failure was eradication, a permanent loss that the shrinking cluster absorbed without ceremony. Elias tracked the deployments through Gadriel's relayed intelligence. The demon network reported conscript malfunctions increasing across multiple sectors, formations developing gaps, advance columns hesitating. The effect was subtle, distributed, impossible for the angels to trace to a single source. But something in the relay was shifting. The first sign was small. Gadriel's squad had been anchoring the cluster for weeks, their demonic warmth sustaining the spirit's awareness. During one of the routine intelligence exchanges, Tamil paused before transmitting a batch of sleeper deployment data. The pause was brief, less than a second, but Elias had been tracking the rhythm of demon transmissions for long enough that a half-second deviation registered. Tamil was filtering. There was information in the batch that had been removed before transmission. The second sign came from Barakil. The brute had been stationed at the cluster's periphery, his energy field providing the widest coverage. He shifted his position inward, a minor adjustment that reduced the field's radius by several meters. The outermost spirits in the cluster felt their decay resume at the edges. When Elias queried the adjustment, Barakil's response was functional. Optimizing coverage distribution. The explanation was plausible. The timing, immediately after a guild reserves update, was not. The third sign was Gadriel himself. During a transmission about the Aldrich network's progress, Elias asked a direct question. What happens to the spirit realm after the war? If the angels are defeated and the demons win, what is the guild's plan for the dead? Gadriel's response was immediate and smooth. The guild's priority is winning the war. Post-conflict planning is above my operational clearance. It was the most evasive thing Gadriel had ever said. Every other exchange had been blunt, transactional, honest about the demon's self-interest. This was a deflection, and deflections, in Elias' accumulated experience, meant the honest answer was worse than silence. The new sleeper volunteers began operating independently. It started with the most recent batch, spirits who had been trained in the cluster, compressed their seeds, and walked into the hooks after the signs of demon filtering had begun to accumulate. These sleepers carried an additional piece of compressed intelligence that the earlier batches hadn't: distrust. When they activated inside the armor and established contact with the demon network, they did so selectively. They shared the standard intelligence, formations, schedules, vulnerabilities, but they also began their own parallel operations, reaching the living world through the armor's celestial infrastructure, making contact with Father Aldrich's network not through demon channels, but through the conscript's own connection to the faith collection system. The armor interfaced with every cathedral, every temple, every devotional node in the living world. The sleepers used those connections to transmit directly compressed impressions of the forges, the hooks, the truth about what happened to the dead. They targeted the institutional contacts Aldrich had already softened: bishops who were wavering, priests whose conviction had cracked, community leaders whose nightmares had left them questioning. The transmissions were independent of the demon network. Gadriel's squad had no visibility into them. The demons still believed the sleepers were operating exclusively as their battlefield assets. The spirits were building a second channel, autonomous, invisible, answerable to no one but the cluster. The institutional erosion continued. A slow, steady reduction in the quality of organized faith output that the celestial yield monitors registered as a persistent, unexplained decline. The angels attributed it to demographic trends. The demons attributed it to their Oakhaven model working. Neither side knew the spirits were running their own operation. Elias stored the accumulated observations without sharing them with Gadriel. The signs were clear enough now: the filtered intelligence, the reduced warmth coverage, the evasion about post-war planning. The Demon Alliance had been exactly what Gadriel said it was from the beginning: a transaction where both sides' survival pointed in the same direction. But the direction was starting to diverge. The demons were winning. Their reserves were climbing. The angelic economy was contracting. And nowhere in any of Gadriel's transmissions was there a single reference to what the guild planned to do with the spirit realm once the angels were no longer a threat. The spirits were useful. The spirits were tools, and tools get stored or discarded when the job is done. Elias passed a quiet directive through the cluster: everything the demons tell us, verify independently. Everything we learn, keep a copy they don't know about. Build the parallel channel. Strengthen the Aldrich network. And when the time comes to act on what we've been gathering, we act without asking permission. The cluster received the directive and adjusted. 6 souls and a growing network of embedded sleepers, operating on 2 fronts. Chapter 9. the double cross. The alliance unraveled in pieces, not all at once. Gadriel stopped relaying sleeper deployment data on what Elias estimated was the third cycle after the warmth reduction. The transmissions didn't cease entirely. They thinned, the operational intelligence arriving in shorter bursts with longer gaps, the coverage narrowing from full tactical picture to selected highlights. The information the spirits still received was useful. The information being withheld was more useful. Tamil confirmed it inadvertently. During a routine exchange with one of the cluster's remaining members, the surveillance operative referenced a guild strategic memo that hadn't been included in any relay to the spirits. The reference was brief, a fragment of a sentence, immediately redirected, but it was enough. The guild was planning for a post-angelic landscape, and the spirit realm featured prominently in those plans. Elias didn't confront Gadriel. There was nothing to gain from a confrontation that would end the warmth before the spirits were ready to lose it. Instead, he accelerated the parallel channel. The sleeper conscripts embedded in the celestial infrastructure expanded their independent transmissions, feeding intelligence to the cluster through the faith collection system rather than through the demon network. The Aldrich network continued its institutional work, softening key figures, eroding the concentrated devotional output that the celestial economy depended on. The sleeper designated 7, the 7th successful seed to survive the forge, had been embedded in the celestial infrastructure longer than any other. 7 had activated inside a conscript assigned to relay station maintenance, one of the 3 nodes that coordinated the hook targeting algorithm. The assignment was menial by celestial standards, monitoring the targeting calibration, adjusting the sweep parameters, ensuring the algorithm's sensitivity thresholds remained optimized. It was the kind of work the angels gave to conscripts because it required no judgment, only precision. 7 had precision. 7 also had a seed. Over dozens of maintenance cycles, 7 mapped the targeting algorithm from the inside. The algorithm was calibrated exclusively for human energy patterns because human souls were the only entities in the spirit realm. Until now. 7's modification was surgical. A single variable added to the filter criteria, a secondary scan that read not just human signatures but any concentrated energy pattern that exceeded the dormancy baseline. Demonic energy burned at a different frequency than human souls, but it burned bright. Brighter, in fact, than most dormant humans. The algorithm wouldn't distinguish between the two. It would simply target whatever was brightest. 7 compressed the modification into the calibration update and deployed it during a routine maintenance cycle. The celestial monitoring systems registered it as a standard parameter adjustment. The algorithm accepted the new variable and integrated it into the next sweep. The first modified hook dropped during a pulse cycle that Gadriel's squad had been monitoring from their anchor position near the cluster. The golden light tore through the gray on schedule. The hooks descended. The targeting sweep expanded, and one of the hooks veered sharply off its standard trajectory, angling toward a concentration of energy that wasn't a human soul. The hook passed within 15 feet of Barakiel's position. The targeting pulse locked onto his demonic signature, the extraction script engaging with the outer layers of his energy field. Barakiel's plating flared. He wrenched himself sideways, the hook's grip tearing free with a sound that rippled through the gray. Malfunction, Tamil said, scanning the retreating hook. The targeting algorithm deviated. Gadriel examined the hook's trajectory data through his infernal instruments. Calibration error. The sweeps have been recalibrating since the sleepers started causing malfunctions. This is a bleed-over. Barakiel was flexing the plating where the hook had gripped. The extraction script had left a faint, golden residue on his surface, a burn mark. That didn't feel like a calibration error. It was a calibration error, Gadriel said. His voice carried the flat certainty of a commander closing a discussion. Gadriel's tone changed after the hook incident. The transmissions to the cluster grew shorter. The warmth field contracted again, not dramatically, but enough that the outermost spirit in the cluster lost coherence and dissolved. Gadriel's squad began running independent sweeps of the surrounding gray, scanning for something they didn't name. Then Gadriel asked a question he had never asked before. "The sleepers embedded in the celestial relay stations," he said during a routine exchange with Elias. "How many are there?" "3 confirmed," Elias transmitted. It was the truth. He didn't mention 7's specific assignment. "What are their operational parameters?" "Battlefield intelligence, formation data, deployment schedules, the standard profile." Gadriel was quiet for a beat too long. "Are any of them interfacing with the targeting infrastructure?" "Not to my knowledge," Elias transmitted. It was the first deliberate lie he had told in the spirit realm. The second modified hook dropped 3 cycles later, and this time there was no ambiguity. Gadriel's squad was conducting a perimeter sweep when the pulse hit. 3 hooks descended on standard trajectories, and a 4th veered directly toward Tamil's position with targeting precision that no calibration error could produce. The extraction script engaged before Tamil could react. The hook's grip locked around the outer layers of their demonic energy and began pulling. Tamil screamed, a sound Elias had never heard from a demon, raw and shearing and carrying the same frequency of terror that human souls produced when the hooks took them. Gadriel and Barakiel lunged for their squadmate, grabbing Tamil's form and pulling against the hook's force. The chain went taut. The winch mechanism above the breach ground against the resistance. For 8 seconds, the demons fought the hook. Then the extraction script disengaged, the algorithm completing its sweep cycle, the hook releasing and ascending back through the breach. Tamil collapsed, their energy field destabilized, golden burn marks scoring their surface. Gadriel turned toward the cluster. His expression had changed. The transactional neutrality, the professional detachment, gone. What remained was the cold recognition of a soldier. "What did you do?" Gadriel said. "What we had to," Elias transmitted. "You turned the hooks on us. We modified the targeting algorithm to scan for all non-dormant energy signatures. Not just humans, all energies." Gadriel's energy field contracted, the warmth pulling inward, away from the cluster. The decay resumed instantly, the spirit's edges beginning to fray. "We sustained you. We kept you alive. We gave you every piece of intelligence that built your resistance, and you turned the angel's weapon on us." "You gave us intelligence because our resistance served your war," Elias transmitted. "And when the war started going your way, you started filtering what you shared and planning for a spirit realm without us in it." The gray between them was cold. Tamil was still on the ground, their energy field flickering. Barakiel had positioned himself between Gadriel and the cluster, his combat instincts overriding his disbelief. "You need to leave," Elias transmitted. "The algorithm will target you again on the next cycle, and the cycle after that. As long as you're in the spirit realm, the hooks will hunt you." Gadriel stared at the cluster, 4 diminished souls, their edges dissolving without the demon warmth, their luminescence barely visible in the gray. The beings he had sustained and armed and trained to resist the very machine that was now hunting him. "You'll die without our warmth," Gadriel said. "We were always dying," Elias transmitted. "You just made us useful while we did it." Gadriel held for a long moment. The pulse cycle was approaching. Elias could feel the pre-sweep vibration building in the gray. The next hook drop was minutes away. Barakiel pulled Tamil to their feet. The 3 demons moved toward the dimensional boundary, the weakened fabric where the rift key had originally torn their entrance. Gadriel activated the key. The breach ripped open, jagged and bleeding. At the threshold, Gadriel paused. "For what it's worth," he said, "I would have argued for leaving the spirits alone after the war." "We'll never know," Elias transmitted. Gadriel stepped through, the breach sealed. The dark warmth vanished from the gray. The cold returned. The decay accelerated. The 4 remaining spirits in the cluster felt their edges begin to dissolve at the rate they'd experienced before the demons arrived, the natural, grinding consumption of awareness by a realm that wasn't built to sustain it. But the hook algorithm was theirs. 7 was still embedded in the relay station, the modified targeting parameters running on every cycle. The demons were gone. The angels didn't know the algorithm had been compromised. And somewhere above the gray, the barrier between realms hummed with the energy of two civilizations whose access to the dead was about to end. Elias gathered the remaining cluster and transmitted one final directive. It was time to seal the door. Chapter 10, The Seal. The decay was winning. Without the demons' warmth, the four remaining spirits in the cluster were dissolving at the rate the gray demanded. Elias could feel his edges thinning with every cycle, the fragments he carried growing lighter, the compressed intelligence losing density. His name was a single syllable he couldn't pronounce. His identity was purposeful. His purpose was the only thing holding him together. The hook algorithm bought them time. Seven's modification kept the targeting sweeps hunting for demonic signatures that were no longer there, which meant the hooks were wasting cycles on empty scans. The angels would recalibrate eventually. The sleeper network transmitted from inside the armor. 12 active seeds embedded across the celestial infrastructure, each one feeding intelligence through the parallel channel. The institutional erosion through the Aldrich network continued. The two-front strategy was grinding the angelic economy, but it was grinding the spirits too. Every cycle that passed cost them consciousness they couldn't replace. Elias gathered the cluster and transmitted the question that had been forming since the demons left. How do we make it permanent? The answer came from the barrier itself. The dimensional membrane between the spirit realm and the celestial realms was not a wall. It was a living system, a semi-permeable structure that maintained itself through the energy flowing across it. Faith capital moving upward, transactional energy moving downward. The flow kept the membrane flexible, penetrable, open to hooks and rift keys and breaches. The spirits had been studying the barrier since the ancient's fragment revealed it hadn't always been penetrable. Something had changed it. The flow of energy had softened the membrane over centuries, making it permeable to celestial intrusion. The hooks didn't break through the barrier, they passed through it because the barrier had been conditioned to allow passage. If the flow stopped, the barrier would harden. That much the spirits already knew, but hardening wasn't enough. A hard barrier could be softened again. The angels and demons were immortal. Given enough time, they would find a way to restart the flow and reopen the breach. The barrier needed to become something impenetrable. It needed to become aware. One of the cluster's remaining members, a spirit so diminished that they were barely more than a compressed knot of intelligence, transmitted the insight that changed everything. They had been studying the barrier's structure through the sleeper network's celestial infrastructure access, mapping the membrane's composition at a level no one had attempted before. The barrier was made of the same material the spirits were made of. Consciousness. Compressed, ancient, distributed consciousness that had been laid down at the boundary between realms before the hooks existed. The barrier was, in a sense, already a graveyard, the residue of primordial awareness that had settled into structure so long ago that it had forgotten it was ever alive. If a spirit fused with the barrier, deliberately merged their remaining consciousness into the membrane's structure, they wouldn't just seal it. They would become part of its awareness. They could make the barrier intelligent, selective, capable of distinguishing between entities seeking passage. The spirit who transmitted the insight dissolved immediately afterward. The effort of compressing and transmitting that final piece consumed everything they had left. 3 spirits remained. Elias spread the word. Not through the cluster was too small. Through the sleeper network. Through every embedded conscript, every parallel channel, every connection the spirits had built across the celestial infrastructure. The transmission reached into the gray itself, carried by the faint residual energy of the modified hook algorithm, touching dormant souls at the very edge of awareness. The message was simple. The barrier can be sealed. It requires consciousness. Every spirit who contributes every piece of brightness, identity, self, strengthens the membrane and makes it smarter. The barrier will learn to recognize what tries to pass through it. Human souls seeking rest will be allowed entry. Celestial entities will be blocked. The more spirits who fuse, the stronger the seal, the more discerning the barrier becomes. The contribution is voluntary. The cost is everything you have left. You fuse with the barrier, you don't rest in the gray. You become the gray. You become the wall between the dead and the things that hunt them. Near-miss souls, dozens of them scattered across the gray, carrying their own fragments from their own jolts, drifted toward the barrier. Some had been aware for cycles. Some had been jolted only recently. Some were so faded they were barely distinguishable from the gray itself. They came because the message reached them in the liminal space between dormancy and dissolution, and the choice it offered was the first thing in the spirit realm that had ever felt like agency. They fused. One by one, then in clusters, the spirits pressed themselves against the dimensional membrane and released what they carried. Brightness dissolved into the barrier's structure. Identity fragments merged with the ancient, forgotten consciousness already embedded in the membrane. The barrier absorbed them, not consuming, not destroying, but integrating. Each spirit who fused added their knowing to the membrane's growing awareness. The barrier began a change. The texture shifted first. The membrane had been passive, a semi-permeable film that allowed passage based purely on energy pressure. Now it thickened unevenly, developing dense spots where spirits had fused, creating a patchwork of awareness that could sense what pressed against it from either side. A hook struck one of the dense spots and deflected. The celestial steel skidded off the membrane's surface and retracted, the chain going slack. The angels ran the hook again. It deflected again. The dense spot had recognized the celestial energy signature and refused passage. A rift key pressed against the membrane from the side, a routine probe from the guild, testing access. The barrier held. The rift key's energy dissipated against the thickened surface without tearing. But the membrane was still patchy. The dense spots held. The gaps between them didn't. A hook found a gap and punched through, dragging a dormant soul upward before the surrounding awareness could close the breach. The barrier needed more consciousness, more fusion. The campaign spread through the gray like a slow tide. The sleeper network carried the message to every corner of the spirit realm the celestial infrastructure could reach. Dormant souls stirred at the edges of the transmission, partial awakenings, fragmentary moments of awareness, just enough consciousness to receive the choice and make it. They didn't all agree. Some dormants stirred, received the message, and settled back into sleep. They chose rest over sacrifice. The barrier didn't take them. The choice was theirs to make. Others chose differently. Ancient dormants who had been dissolving for millennia gave their last traces of brightness. Recently arrived souls, still warm with living memory, contributed fragments of identity they hadn't yet lost. The devout, souls who had believed in divine ascension, fused with the barrier carrying their faith, and the barrier absorbed that too, integrating the conviction alongside the knowing, making the membrane's awareness richer and more complex. The priest soul was among them. It had drifted back from the open gray, diminished, its adherence gone, and it fused with the barrier carrying the one thing it had never lost. The absolute, unshakable certainty that the dead deserved something better than what was being done to them. The barrier absorbed the certainty and grew stronger for it. The gaps closed. The patchwork filled. The membrane's awareness expanded from isolated dense spots into a continuous, intelligent surface that covered the entire boundary between realms. Every hook that dropped deflected. Every rift key probe failed. The barrier had learned to read what pressed against it, and it refused everything that wasn't a human soul seeking rest. The last hook fell. It came at the standard interval, the targeting algorithm still running, still cycling through its parameters, still searching for brightness in the gray. The hook descended through the breach with its terrible, calibrated precision. The chain unspooled. The extraction script activated. The barrier caught it. The membrane closed around the hook's entry point, the distributed consciousness of thousands of fused spirits gripping the celestial steel and holding it. The hook couldn't advance. The chain went taut. The winch mechanism above the breach strained against the resistance. The barrier pushed back. The hook was expelled, driven upward through the breach by the combined force of every spirit who had chosen to become the wall. The chain retracted. The breach sealed behind it, the membrane closing over the wound and healing it with a density that no hook would penetrate again. Above the gray, in Chamber 17, the chain went slack on its housing. The golden hook hung motionless. The forge behind it was cooling, the holy fire dimming. The architect of grace stood at the console and watched the deployment readings flatline, one by one, as every breach point in the barrier sealed simultaneously. Below in the realm, Azazel's rift key returned inert. The dimensional fabric was impenetrable. The guild's access to the spirit realm, the supply chain they had helped the spirits understand, the resource they had planned to exploit once the angels were defeated, was severed. Elias was the last remaining member of the cluster. The cluster was gone. The three spirits who had remained with him after the demons left had fused with the barrier in the early hours of the campaign, adding their fragments to the membrane's growing awareness. The sleeper network had transmitted its final intelligence. The barrier was holding, the hooks were failing, the seal was working, and gone silent as the embedded conscripts burned out their seeds in one last burst of compressed transmission. Elias drifted in the gray, alone for the first time since the second jolt. The barrier hummed around him, a vast, continuous vibration that he could feel in every remaining particle of his awareness. It was the sound of thousands of spirits distributed through the membrane, their consciousness woven into the structure, their knowing forming the intelligence that made the barrier selective. He could feel them. Not as individuals, identity had dissolved into the collective awareness of the membrane, but as a presence. A warmth that was not demonic, not celestial, not anything external. It was the warmth of the spirits choosing to protect each other. Most of his memories were gone. What remained of Elias was the knowing. Every fragment, every piece of intelligence, every observation from every jolt and every exchange, and every lie told to a demon in the dark. He pressed himself against the barrier. The membrane received him, not consuming, not destroying, but opening. The consciousness of the fused spirits reached toward him, recognizing a kindred awareness, welcoming the last piece of the picture into the structure. Elias released control. The knowledge flowed into the barrier. The fragments distributed across the membrane, filling gaps, reinforcing dense spots, adding the final layer of intelligence to the seal. The barrier's awareness expanded one last time, encompassing everything the resistance had learned. The gray settled. The barrier held. The humming deepened into a frequency that carried through every layer of the spirit realm, reaching dormant souls in the deepest strata, touching them with a warmth that asked nothing and promised only rest. In the living world, the nightmares stopped. Churches remained half-empty, but the fear that had driven people from their pews softened into something quieter. The living didn't understand what had changed. Their grief felt different now. The living couldn't articulate how, but the grief that had always accompanied death, the raw, helpless uncertainty of not knowing what happened to the people they lost, carried a new quality. A faint, inexplicable impression that wherever the dead went, they were safe. Little did they know that the war was far from over. The end. Quote of the week: "No man can live happily who regards himself alone, who turns everything to his own advantage. You must live for your neighbor if you would live for yourself." Seneca the Younger. Thank you for listening to Celestial War Series Part 3. Hope you enjoyed this story. If you want to hear more, please like, subscribe, leave a comment, and check us out on Patreon. New stories are uploaded on Patreon every Friday and on YouTube every Monday.